your host for this evening, and as always, I'm joined by three panelists who will be sharing their thoughts on our theme this evening, which is poverty, and we'll be looking at Acts chapter 4. So I invite our panelists to introduce themselves now. So Hannah, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Hannah Brown. I work for the Joint Public Issues team. So that's the way that the United Reformed Church works with the Methodist Church, the Church of Scotland and the Baptist Union, all kind of coming together to work on public issues and issues of public policy. And so poverty and inequality is one of the key areas of our work. And we've been working in this area together for over 10 years on issues like the welfare state and other issues around poverty and inequality.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Vicky, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Vicky Longbone. I'm a CRCW, or Church-Related Community Worker based in Derby, a Community Development Minister. I work predominantly in an area with families with very low incomes. So it's a slightly different angle to what we perceive as poverty, but a very needy area to be working in.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. And Lucy?
Hi, good evening. It's nice to be here. I'm Lucy Solinske, and I live and work in Gateshead, which is just south of Newcastle, for those of you that don't know the Northeast very well. I'm employed by the Methodist Church with two roles that are very connected. One is community development work. So, like Vicky's described, some parts of Gateshead have been economically left behind, some have not, and I work with churches to think about how we can resource our communities to serve one another within all that variety of communities. And I'm also involved in something called Gateshead Poverty Truth Commission, which is really fun and a bit stressful, but it involves people with lived experience of poverty from across Gateshead coming together with people who hold power to develop relationships and together to share their different kinds of expertise to think about what a better future might look like for Gateshead and to try and put that into action.
Okay, thank you. So you've heard a little bit about our three panelists for this evening, and welcome to all of our panelists, and welcome to everybody who is watching or listening to tonight's episode on our new podcast. If you're watching live, you've got the opportunity, as always, to interact and send in your comments and questions. So the information is on your screen. You can do that via Slido. We'd love to hear from you and to hear what you have to say on this topic too, and we'll do our best to ask as many of your questions to the panelists. So we're going to have a time of prayer before we start our discussion. So let's pray. Dear Lord, we have thanks that we're able to meet this evening, and we pray that we will have a good conversation on this important topic of poverty. Please guide our conversations as we explore the topic and the way that it impacts people day to day. Please guide each of our panelists and those who are sending in questions as well to help this to be a fruitful conversation. Amen. Okay, so we'll be looking at poverty, and our passage for this evening is we're looking at the book of Acts, chapter 4. So I will begin with an introduction to that, to Acts 4. So Acts tells the story of how the first church was formed and grew. So after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the disciples traveled to many places to spread the good news. And leaders like Peter and John told about Jesus, even when doing so landed them in prison, which is what happens at the start of this chapter. So the leaders, the religious leaders at the time, had seen them preaching and healing people, and they were put into prison overnight for doing so. Sorry, I lost my page. So they were put into prison, and the leaders were not sure how to respond to them. So there were questions about what they were doing. it goes on to talk about the cornerstone as well. So Jesus being the cornerstone, the stone that builders rejected, which has become the cornerstone, and salvation is found in no one else than him. The believers go on in the next section to be praying on, and on their release, Peter and John go back to the people as well, and the community come together, and it ends in the passage about the communities coming together and sharing their possessions. So it says the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. And it says that there was no needy person among them. And it goes on to say that people were sharing food, land, and all of their possessions as well. So it's interesting to think about this being the early church, the Christian church, how it was formed, and what we can learn from the models of this early church in this discussion as we reflect on poverty. So our first question that we will look at is, what is the most important part of this passage for you in relation to poverty? So we'll be asking that to our panelists in a moment, but also for you who are watching and listening, I'd encourage you to reflect on that, and you can send in your comments as well. But let's hear the thoughts of our panelists first. So let's start with Lucy. What was the most important part for you in this passage?
This is a bit of a cop-out, Tom, because the most important passage for me is the fact that these different stories about evangelism and about church growth and about like praise and worship and danger, the danger that Paul and John were in, but also about communal living and about this form of living which makes so that those who are wealthier share with those who are poorer. We've got this like beautiful distribution. The fact that they're all together, that if this is like a snapshot of the early church, it's not orientated around one of those activities. And I think I'm thinking about this lots as some of the churches I work with reopen, and we're in danger of becoming a church which is really orientated towards a Sunday morning. Whereas this passage for me is a really good reminder that actually, when we think about poverty, it's not something that we remember once we've got our church service back up and running, or we're already a growing church, but it's actually what it means to be a living and breathing community of Christ, to think about our poorer neighbours.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. And Vicky, could you share your thoughts on what you think is the most important part?
I mean, you can't read this passage without talking about distribution of wealth. It's there. You can't change what that says at all. And it is a really important point. But I think what I found interesting is that within the passage, you can see examples of why people can be in poverty that I think were relevant then and are particularly relevant today. So you very much have that at the beginning. It's all about power and who can arrest them, and you know, who throws them in jail. You know, it's basically they've got a fear of losing their power because this great crowd of people are guiding around them. So power has a massive part to play in poverty. Another example I noticed was education. They are called unschooled and ordinary men. You know, they had no right to speak out. They weren't qualified to say any of these things. And again, it's, you know, education is a massive part of poverty. And, you know, there was and still is that presumption, you know, you've got that look, you've got that person, you're never going to be educated. And, you know, when you're in a cycle of low paid jobs, lack of education, you know, and it's hard for people to get out of that. And I think the other thing, and I think Lucy touched on this a bit as well, a little bit, is their voice isn't heard. It is, Simon and John definitely get their point heard, but they're told, go away and say no more. And again, that is such a true example of how people can become so trapped in poverty. obviously there is a big difference, and if we could all follow the example of being so truly filled by the Spirit that we could speak out with the courage that Peter and John did.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Vicky. Before I ask Hannah, just a reminder for those who are watching that you can send in your comments. So please do send those in through Slido. We'd love to hear from you. So Hannah, same question to you about the most important part for you.
I mean, these guys have covered some of the fab bits so far, and they were definitely things that stood out to me as I read it. I think one of my favorite parts about this is, like Lucy said, it goes from talking about kind of salvation in terms of like who saves and that Jesus is the cornerstone, talk about kind of spiritual salvation and being saved. And then it goes on to talk about like the practical needs of people. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important that both of those things are kind of classed as necessary. And that if this is a picture of how the leaders of the early church are building God's kingdom, they know that people need to have their needs met in their spiritual lives and in their physical lives, that they need to make sure that everybody has what they need. And that's part of the structures that they're establishing. They're not just going out to preach in the temple, but they're also managing their wealth properly so that everybody has what they need. And that those are both priorities for the way that they're living. And I think it's really interesting taking passages like this, because some people might say, oh, this is a picture of how we should live now. How do we kind of map this onto what I do tomorrow? And some people might say, okay, let's look at what's behind this. It might not work exactly this way today in my community, but what's behind this is a recognition that as church, we need to think about the needs people have spiritually as well as the needs people have practically. And there are really practical things we can put in place. And in terms of our response to poverty, it's recognizing that is as much the mission of the church as seeking to share the gospel in terms of spiritual salvation for people.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, lots of great things to get our conversation started and lots to think. I wonder, having now heard each other, have you got any other thoughts to add or comments on what you've heard from each other?
Can I go?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Vicky and Hannah, your answers made so much sense and made me think, if Vicky, you were talking about power and how those, I think in Acts 4, it's 5,000 Christians managed to scare the authorities so much that they did let these guys go, to let them off. So they slipped through the net sort of thing because of the power of the people. And then Hannah, you're talking about what the church looks like today. 5,000 Christians, we've got loads more than that. What would it look like if we, as the church, as hundreds and thousands of Christians, stood up to the people in power and said, this isn't good enough? And actually, people, when they come together, can make a difference, can't they? If we mobilize and if we stand together against injustice, that's such a lovely model for saying, actually, the powers that be and the authorities that exist don't have to be this way. We can offer something more hopeful.
Yeah,
I think there's something we can definitely pull out the passage from that, Lucy, that actually the model of power is different as well, that they might have power in numbers, but they've also got power in the relationships that they have with each other. So it's not a power of striking fear into somebody, a bit like the kind of religious leaders gathering together, and they kind of name all the religious leaders and say that they were kind of trying to scare them into submission. But then you've got this picture of how they're treating one another in the idea of sharing their possessions. And I think there's something transformative about the church today, and the church then not just having power in number and in being able to stand up, but being able to demonstrate a relational kind of power that isn't about scaring somebody into change, but about transforming change.
Okay, thanks, Hannah.
And that's hard in reality, because people don't have the belief that John and Paul had about, Peter and John. I don't know why I keep getting the wrong name.
I keep getting the name confused as well, Vicky. Too many blokes.
To have that faith and to feel so truly led by the Spirit to stand up and do that. Mm. And we do have to do that collectively, but somehow we have to encourage those around us to feel that they have the strength and courage to do it as well. And in reality, that's hard, particularly within some of our churches and the demographics that we've got. You know, I'm well into campaigning, but I couldn't imagine getting any of my church members to actually come and stand out on the street and wave a banner. And, you know, if every Christian or every church member actually went and held out that banner as well, what a voice could be heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, when you mentioned power, I thought when you said power has a massive part to play. And I think when often poverty is seen as the material poverty, so not having money, not having food, but actually the power and voice has, like you said, has a big part to say in that. And through lack of power and abuse of power, sometimes it can lead to injustice and lead to poverty as well. So we also had our second question. So it is moving on to about what are the most challenging or difficult parts of the passage for you? So who would like to start us off on that one? What did you find difficult or challenging?
I'm quite happy to start with these.
Yeah.
As much as I have agreed with Lucy and Hannah, the bit that I struggle with the most is being the cornerstone, being recognised by Christ, and all of that. And salvation, if salvation only comes in Jesus's name, what about those people that have never heard of Jesus, or they've never heard of the Jesus that you and I know and love and worship? So a lot of people out there, they have an image of the church. I've worked with a lot of families in poverty over the last 6 months. And a lot of them are so disillusioned by the church. You know, we're going to go to church and we're going to get hit round the head with the Bible. And, you know, I can't go to church because I haven't got smart enough clothes. And so people have got those images. But they're out there, and I apologise if this offends anyone, but they're out there acting more Christ-like than a lot of the people I know within my own churches. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, I cannot believe in a God that would say, no salvation for you because you don't claim to know me. Okay. But I totally understand what you two have said about it being feeding spiritually and physically, and I totally understand that. So I'm not completely poo-pooing it. I just find it really difficult to think that we're trying to exclude people from God's kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Vicky, I think that's such a call for the church to be transformed by, rather than just seeking to kind of include people, for the church to step into a different space. And I think one of the things that really changed my impressions about all of this was somebody talking to me about how sometimes we think about kind of going on into the margins of society as like going to a place a place that doesn't have stuff, or without material stuff or power, like we've talked about. But actually throughout the Bible, throughout the Gospels, Jesus says, that's where I am. And so actually what we're doing is stepping to a place that's full of God, that's full of opportunities to encounter God, because that's where Jesus says, like, that's where I'm going to hang out, is on the margins. And so how we need to be a church that can see the opportunity to say, this isn't about stepping into a place where you have to give something up or go without, but about stepping into a place where we're going to encounter God in a completely different way and can be transformed. We don't go in with kind of all our bags packed ready to like change the situation, but if we go in with empty hands, we're going to like be receiving so much more.
You know, I read something the other day and it really like struck a chord with me. So I might be saying this because it's my latest hobby horse, but I'm pretty sure that it connects with what you've both just said. So I totally agree that when I read the like this early church talking about Jesus being the cornerstone and salvation all through him, I think, well, that's very well and good. But when I look at the church today, I think sometimes we are guilty of being an institution like the Pharisees and the Sadducees are in the New Testament, actually. And I think when we paint them as big baddies, we do the New Testament a disservice. They're probably more like you and I, who actually might worship in institutions where we say this is where Jesus is, and actually there are some bars you have to jump over to get to. But I read this really interesting article the other day that said that as Christians, which often mean that we stand on the side of institution, we need to stop thinking that we're Jesus and asking what would Jesus do and going and helping people. In fact, we should say, what would Zacchaeus do? So like Zacchaeus was someone who was on the side of the institution. He was a tax collector. Everyone looked at him and thought, don't want to be friends with you. But when he encountered Jesus, he was changed and he had the opportunity to convert and like have this huge conversion. And maybe as Christians, when we do encounter people who are in the margins, or we go to places where we traditionally thought Jesus wasn't, and we were taking Jesus, maybe we need to remember that we're probably a bit more like Zacchaeus and ask, what would Zacchaeus do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Which calls for a whole new industry of WWZD wristbands. So if anyone wants to invest in my startup, let me know.
I've been doing several courses and things since kids have gone back to school, and I've got nothing to do, and it's really weird after doing 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 months. So I've been catching up on some training that I should do, and I've been doing a lot of stuff about pioneer ministry, fresh expressions, and there was one conversation, and we were talking about where church could be. And so there was one example of church being on the football pitch, and they would all meet before their football match. They'd have a get together and a bit of a Bible discussion and prayer. They'd go and play their football, and then they'd sit in the pub afterwards, drinking and discussing it all. So it very naturally started from one Christian going and joining a football team, and that's what developed out of it. And there were lots of other little examples like that. And one gentleman turned around and said, so actually what you're asking us to do is run social clubs and drop Jesus in occasionally. And I couldn't help myself but went, is that not exactly what our churches are anyway? You know, it's, what difference is it where church, whatever church may be, but where God's people gather, where we see God's kingdom? And I'm sorry, but it's not within our own four walls. It is out there in their lives, not ours.
Great. I think there might be more to explore in that question, so we'll perhaps come back to that as well. But we have had a question come in from our viewers, so I want to to pass that on as well. So the question is, as well as addressing people in power to take action on poverty and inequality, how can we approach people in our own communities whose views perpetuate injustice? For example, people who say, look at all those scroungers taken from the state. So how do we approach people in our own communities perpetuating injustice? Does anyone have any thoughts to share on that question?
Building relationships, which you'll find is often my answer to most things, but actually it is that getting to know the real people. You know, from the homeless guy that sits outside the church, oh, well, he just can't be bothered, he's a drug addict. Well, actually, he's got a really tough story behind him. And actually meeting those people and finding out why they are in the situations they're in. I am not going to deny that there are people that are quite happy to live in the situations they're in. But there are also a lot that struggle all of the time. And you know, it is that going out on the street. Unless we introduce people like this, there's no experience of the reality of it. And it's not easy to do. It's really, really hard to try and bring people together when they're so polar opposite, to build that relationship. So it's not an easy one.
Okay.
Unless Lucy or Hannah are going to come up with the magic answer.
Do you want to go, Hannah?
I have no idea. I was going to say that starts with really listening, and that's really hard. Like, I remember having to do we did an activity once in a prayer session where we had to set a place at the table for somebody that we didn't really agree with, or somebody that we wouldn't really want to be in the room with, and lay them a place at the table to come and eat with us, to come and share in conversation. And I remember finding it really hard, thinking, I think I'm often up for chatting to people who I think are persuadable to my opinion, but I don't really want to sit down and engage with people who I feel like their view is damaging to others. So if people say, their people on benefits are just scroungers, or they're workless and they don't want to make a difference in their own life, but actually there probably aren't that many people who listen to them in the first place. And so just listening and finding out where they come from and why their opinions might come from that place is so much better than just classing them as somebody who is a stereotype as well. But yeah, that's really hard, and it's tiring, and it's not something we can ever do by ourselves. I think we only get the strength for that kind of thing, both from community and from God.
I heard an interview with Elizabeth Oldfield the other day, and she heads up a really cool Christian think tank called Theos. And she was talking about the way we've become almost like silos in church, like, oh, those people over there believe that, and we believe this, and we're probably right, actually. And I think the same goes for how we think about politics and poverty, and actually we see world politics really pulling away from each other, don't we? And she spoke about this, like that it was a corporate sin. So if you look at the life of Jesus and the early church, that actually being unity and listening to one another is really, really important. And she said that the first thing we can all do to be part of that is to try and fight our fight or flee mechanism. So when we talk to someone who says stuff like that really is perpetuating the things that we know are really difficult, our natural instinct is to either be like, you monster, and to fight them, or to flee and just say, do you know what, I can't be part of this conversation. And I've had that with like family members where I think, if I stay at this dinner table at Christmas Day anymore, there's going to be a fight, so I'm gonna go and do some washing up. But Elizabeth Oldfield says that when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, he's literally talking about countering your fight or flight mechanism, because turning the cheek is neither of those things, is it? And she says, actually, maybe we need to do that in our relationships. And so when people give us views that we find we have bodily reactions to just stop and like listen to our bodily reactions and say, tell me more. Or like, I can't believe that you believe that, because I think something so different. Tell me how you've come to believe that. And actually, like exactly what you were saying, Vicky and Hannah, that by opening those dialogues and doing that really deep listening, although it is costly emotionally, I think it is what we are called to do.
I've got a couple of amazing things that have happened since I've been in post here. And we had one coffee morning. It was described as being more than a coffee morning, but it was actually a coffee morning where, you could do some flower arranging or make a card or something. And I brought some homeless people in. And the people that go were all church members. They're all majority female and all elderly. And when I first took these lads in, they tried very hard not to show it, but they all went. Within 6 months, they are asking the church if they can have a washing machine put in so that they can clean the clothes for the homeless people. They've asked if the church can become a care of address, and they're just welcoming and loving these people. On the same hand, they have a social evening. We call it the Youth Club for Grown-Ups. And I've introduced some people with learning difficulties to that. And again, you know, the first week they came, I was the only person that would talk to them, and everybody just looked so uncomfortable. And now they're going, oh, I'll bring some more along, you know, and it's actually putting them in that situation, and it's harsh. You know, and it's a big step to take and to challenge these people with. But I believe that's what I'm called here to do. And so it's about us being the example for the church as individuals, which then will change, hopefully, the sort of attitude of the church. And then the church will start to give a more reasoned outlook to the whole of society. You know, we have to demonstrate what it is. We have to encourage our churches to demonstrate what this relationship building is about. And that's the only way we're going to reach out to our community. And I say again, it's not easy. I am blessed to be in a position where I can actually throw that at the church that I'm in. And I'm very blessed to have a church that normally stand up to the challenges that I set them.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. We've had a comment come in which relates to when we were talking about salvation in our discussion earlier. So a viewer said, salvation is a free gift of God's grace. But if we want to reach our full potential, we need to commit our whole lives to building God's vision of love and justice for all people. It's not about saying, I believe in Jesus, so everything's okay, but saying, I believe in Jesus, so I know God will be with me despite life's issues to help me make a difference. So that's, yeah, thank you for that comment. And again, relating about making a difference, there's a question as well about the passage. So it says that in this passage, so in Acts 4, the disciples are arrested for making a difference. Should we go that far? Thoughts on that? So,
have either of you been arrested? Have either of you put yourself in positions where you, like, I suppose when I think about that, I think about Extinction Rebellion at the moment, and I've never put myself in that position. I really admire people who do. Hannah's shaking her head. Vicky, have you?
Not to the scale of doing something that would get me arrested. I would say. I'd like to think I'm involved in no, I'm not saying that they're not legitimate, but my idea of a protest is not to disrupt the general public. You go for the powers that be. I mean, it's in the passage, isn't it? Who do we obey, God or the law? It's a hard one. Because believe me, there's things that I believe we should and shouldn't be doing that go against the law. Don't ask me for an example right now, but, you know, there are things in our British laws that go against our biblical teachings. And what do you do in that situation?
Yeah.
I'd love some more feedback from the young people on that topic as well.
I think it's helpful and
sorry.
I was going to say, like Extinction Rebellion and other groups like that who use things like non-violent direct action around their protest. I think it's helpful to see it not as I want to get arrested because that's going to make the difference. It's part of creating kind of a web of ways of standing up and making noise. I think it becomes a challenge when we see kind of disruption and only disruption as the way of making a difference, because actually we've already talked about building relationship, and transformation is something that happens with the whole of society. And if we start to alienate people from that process, then we're going to struggle to get everybody on board. And I'm not saying it's not necessary sometimes to do things that really push people to making change. Sometimes we need urgent action, and the only way to get that is to really put it and force it on the agenda for people. But that should always be done with a recognition that we're all people who need change, including those people who are making decisions that we don't like.
Lucy, what are your thoughts on the question?
I don't know. I mean, there are people of faith and none who have got arrested for causes they believed in ways that haven't put people at risk and have just really challenged institutions. And I think that's really cool. And I have never done that. And that involves a lot of sacrifice, doesn't it? Like the potential of the criminal record.
It goes back to the same thing. If every Christian was out there with their banner raised, A, they couldn't arrest everyone, and B, it would be such a unity. I am a great passionate person that we should have called it the Uniting Reforming Church, because why are we not just working as one bunch of Christians? Shut some of the churches around here and we'd have full churches in the other ones, and what a powerful place that would be. But yeah.
Yeah, I think reading this Bible verse, I really zone in on that, sharing possessions and everyone had enough. Because actually, for me, where I am in life, that sounds really good. What I don't zone in on is that getting arrested for your faith, or the bit I was going to say that really challenges me is where Barnabas at the end goes and sells a field to give all his money to the church. That really challenges me because that's much more than tithing, isn't it? That's another bit of sacrifice. Like, yeah, I might be happy to, make a little donation here and there now and again. But would I, if you asked me to go and sell my car and gave it to the church, I mean, I'm not going to do that. and so that's such a challenge, isn't it? That people in this passage are making real, like, physical, worldly sacrifices because they are just so invested in this Christ-following community. I need to go away and really do some thinking about that.
Yeah. I'm picking up on that bit when you said about the sacrifice and the sharing, but it said about no one claimed their possessions for their own and they shared everything they had. And about there was also it says about how there was no needy person among them. I wonder, do you think that would be realistic now that that there would be no? So effectively, you could look at that as the early church solving poverty that they in their community. Do you think that could be realistic now?
I actually did some reflecting on this exact thing this afternoon, so excuse me if I turn to some of the notes I've got written down. But I've looked at the reasons. So yes, wouldn't it be a wonderful world if there was actually a completely equal distribution of wealth? Wouldn't it be amazing? But there's 3 levels of this. So you've got the wider world, you've got the whole world level, where distribution will never be equal because human beings are greedy and they want power, and money is power. And so we're never going to get equal distribution, because whether we like it or not, those 8 people that have got more money than the rest of the world, or whatever the statistics are never going to get rid of that. So I think on a worldwide issue, it's huge, and there's not a lot we're ever going to be able to do about that. I think when we talk about churches, what does distribution of wealth look like within churches? Now, and I'm not talking about the individuals in the churches, I am talking about each individual building as a church. And what is the purpose of the funds that church has? So I know that there are some churches that run month by month and struggle to pay the bills. Totally aware of that situation. I am also aware that there are other churches that squirrel away their money, invest it in bonds or whatever they invest in, because they're concerned about the rainy day. But actually, how do we make them realise that the rainy day is today? I will struggle with a church spending lots and lots of money on for example, new altar table, when actually there's far more needs just outside of our door that we're ignoring. And then as individual Christians, or, you know, just individuals in general, but people of faith, what do we actually give to people in poverty? And I have to say, I agree with Lucy. I would never give up my car, but I do get quite upset, hurt, it's not the right way, but I struggle when I see members of our churches turn up in their huge BMWs, when we've got people that are walking miles to get to the church and they're not offering them lifts. And actually, sorry, but if you can afford a car like that, you can afford to go and support someone in the street. But actually what I really thought about is it's not about the money that we share, it's about creating those long-term transformations so that people feel part of it. So it's part of that distribution, but distribution of life as well as wealth. You know, I mean, I live in the dream world that we will one day to come to an equal distribution of wealth. And then it goes back to the same thing, you know, we have to, as people within our churches, we have to show that within ourselves. We need to encourage the churches to take a serious look at what they're using their money for. And again, you know, one would hope that that has a knock-on effect to wider society as well.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Vicky. So yeah, I wonder with that, if we're saying that we're aiming to have no needy people, what could we be doing? And I wonder, Hannah, if there's anything from your work within JPIT that you think, like, actions that people could be taking, and whether you could share a little bit for those who perhaps haven't heard of JPIT, what JPIT is, and as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that JPIT is kind of employed to do on behalf of the churches is to enable our churches to raise their voice kind of nationally, but also locally, on issues of injustice and conflict, and seek to bring about justice and peace. And so we're involved in kind of how the church can bring a distinctive contribution to those conversations, as well as kind of mobilizing our church members to take action. And often that kind of plays out in national campaigns. And so we'll team up with other people to call for changes to our policy systems. So the decisions that people make at a government level, that kind of, you can see it trickling down to how that affects people day to day. And thinking about how we can make those systems more just. And we really want to be linked up with things like the work Lucy does with Poverty Truth Commissions, to say that those processes should be shaped by conversations around lived experience. So I think probably really practically two of the things that we're talking about at the moment directly in relation to poverty and kind of meeting people's need is one of the things that passage talks about and that we've been talking about, meeting people's need tomorrow. And there are so many longer term things, but how do we meet people's needs tomorrow? Vicky talked about low income families in her communities, people who are working but just still don't have enough to make ends meet. One of the campaigns that we're behind at the moment is the Keep the Lifeline campaign. And that's like a whole coalition of faith groups, but also charities and kind of people working at a grassroots level, saying that during the pandemic, about £20 was added to universal credit per week, which is the universal credit is the welfare system we have in the UK at the moment. So most often that's people in jobs that don't pay enough, kind of getting their wages topped up by a benefit system. So extra money was added to that because we recognise that COVID means that there's so much more expense for people, and that actually work was lost for people, and that's really changed their budgets, but also how much they need to spend just to make ends meet. And so that at the moment is a £20 uplift to universal credit. That stops in April. Universal credit is not enough for people day to day. It doesn't provide it, like, just the bottom line is it doesn't provide enough for people who are in work or people who aren't working for various different reasons. And so we're calling on the government to keep that lifeline, to keep strengthening universal credit. In the long term, it needs big picture reform. But right now, to meet people's need, that lifeline needs to be kept. And so we're part of the Keep the Lifeline campaign. So if you put hashtag Keep the Lifeline into Twitter, search it on Facebook, you will find that, and you can sign up and join in and write to your MP around that. Using up lots of your time, but the other big one for us at the moment is a campaign that we've just launched called Reset the Debt. So we know that about 6 million people, 6 million households have fallen behind on one or more household bill because of coronavirus. So since coronavirus and the lockdown, 6 million households haven't been able to pay their council tax, their rent, their utility bills. And actually in the last 3 months, 1 in 5 households have had to borrow just for like food or other essentials. So just to make ends meet. That's crazy that 1 in 5 households, that you could probably look out of your window and like look at 5 houses and know that one of them had to borrow. We think that that's an unprecedented situation that isn't going to be met by any of the existing schemes to help people. So we're calling on the government to cancel that debt, so to buy it up and to write it off, so that people who have fallen into debt because of coronavirus are given a firm foundation for what's coming next. So if you search resetthedebt.uk, you can write to your MP through that to invite them to get involved with the campaign and to call for that action. So they're 2 really practical things that you could probably go and search and do after this. It'll take you 5 minutes to write to your MP on both of those issues to say people have a need and this is how we can meet it.
Honestly, that Keep the Lifeline campaign, I just feel so strongly that has to stay. Like the folks that I know who are on universal credit, we found out, I spoke to one bloke and he was like, you see, this must be a mistake. No way if I got another £20 a week. I have to choose not to believe that this is happening because I will be too excited. And then when he found out this was a policy change, like it's made such a difference to his life. Like it's gone from real subsistence to like just like speaking about maybe like being able to go to the beach for the first time in a few years, or saving up some money to be able to go and visit family, like stuff that makes a life. It is still not enough, and I totally agree, Hannah, that universal credit needs long-term reform, but £20 a week, like it needs to stay. So I know.
And for some of the families, particularly that I walked alongside, that £20 was nothing, because, I mean, even with the food provision that they were getting from us, and things that I had never thought about, the kids are at home 24/7, the gas bill's gone up, the electric bill's gone up,
Yeah,
the food bill obviously has gone up. You know, they're driving me nuts. We have to get out and do something. That costs money. And I think it was quite shocking for me to hear some of the stories I did throughout the main lockdown. The fact that, you know, this food parcel is great and we really appreciate eating, but actually, have we got any access to money that would help pay or get our electric reconnected? Particularly when a lot of the people in those situations are still working with electric meters, which means they're paying more for their electric than you and I, because they can't commit to one payment every month or whatever. So yeah, for some people, most definitely the £20 is going to make a, like you say, life-changing difference. I can suddenly go away for a weekend, you know. But for others, it just still hasn't touched the surface.
Yeah, I have to say that, guys, a single bloke. So for single people getting universal credit, that I know it made a difference. For families, I spoke to a woman the other day and she said that one of her bills, I can't remember which one, she saw was £200 more than she anticipated because of lockdown, having the kids at home. And even if you've got like a £15 school meal voucher and £20 on your universal credit, not going to cover your bills, is it? You're so right, Vicky, and I shouldn't sing that policy's praises too much because it really is just scraping the surface. But I think that, and this sort of relates back to the question about whether we can believe that poverty can be eradicated. Like that's a fundamental question here, isn't it? And I think we have to believe as Christians, like in this promise of like a world no longer broken, like the kingdom of God, we have to keep working towards it. And sometimes that feels like tiny baby steps. But £20 a week is a tiny baby step. And cancelling some household debt would be another little step, and like slowly, like what's the quote? The arc of the universe curves towards good. And I think that isn't a given, that isn't granted. We shouldn't take that for granted. We have to be part of making sure that we are like arching towards the kingdom of God.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one which we've not got time, but I wanted to share a question so that people can know one that has been sent in, and perhaps to leave it with people to think about afterwards, so that this can be a launch. We want you to carry on having conversations and reflecting. But someone's asked about, how do you help people experience poverty to get out of poverty? So is it about destroying systems of oppression, developing practical skills and budgeting, or changing the mindsets of those experiencing poverty and those who can help? So what's the spiritual change that could make a difference? So coming back to that question, what can we be doing to help those who are living in poverty to get out of poverty as well, and what steps could we do?
Everything that you suggest is a very quick answer. You need to combine everything that has been suggested there. And the spiritual side, when you build those relationships, people will naturally start. One of the most common questions I get is, are you really a minister? You don't look like a minister. And through that, you automatically build relationships, and they can see the church is more than being hit around the head with the Bible. And I keep coming back to it, but yeah, do everything that you do, you suggest there, and encourage others to do it with you.
Great, thank you. John, when Hannah was speaking earlier, she mentioned about the Poverty Truth Commission, which I know, Lucy, you're involved with in Gateshead. Could you share briefly a little bit about what is the Poverty Truth Commission?
Yeah, I would love to. So for the past wee while, I've been working with a group of people from across Gateshead who all have experiences of poverty, and they look very different. We've got a couple of people who've come through the asylum system, which I imagine that you know is a violent system. It inflicts real suffering on people often, and that's their experience. We've got people who led fairly middle class lives and then had things like utterly uncontrollable situations lead them into poverty. And then we've got people who are in communities that have, say, I don't like any of the language around it, but like communities that have been left behind, and like look around and think, gosh, what else is there for this community? And they're a class bunch of people, and I really, really like spending time with them. But spending time together is not the purpose. We had our launch event in March, and we stormed the council chambers. We went to Gateshead Council, and we got all the people in power, all the people who make decisions, to sit around as our audience. And this group of class Gateshead folk got up and told some of their stories about poverty and said, this is a reality of what's happened to me. I think if you stop there at just telling stories, then it can be quite manipulative. You can be using people who have experience of poverty in order to make like the middle class people in power feel something. And that, to me, that isn't particularly ethical. But the Poverty Truth Commission begins at that point, because at that point, the people from Gateshead who experience poverty step forward and say, will you join us? And we've invited an equal number of people who hold positions of power in Gateshead, and they're in a range of industries. We've got people from the council and from housing, but also people from banks and universities and the director of an art gallery to come and join us and to work together and to build relationships. So going back to what we were saying before, like we are so different and we hold such different amounts of power, and perhaps we both have very different worldviews. What does it mean to spend time together? And also, what does it mean to spend time together thinking about things that actually both of our lives revolve around? If you work in Gateshead Housing Association enacting policies that mean that the people who live in the council housing have a really rough time of it, if those two people come together and just share their realities, then change can happen. And there are poverty truth commissions across the UK, and the evidence is that when those two groups of people come together and spend a meaningful amount of time together, that change happens. So we're in the early stages, but it's really exciting. It's really countercultural. I think it's just one tool in the toolbox for the ways that we make change, but I think it's an exciting one, and I think it's a different one, and I hope that it's going to be good news for Gateshead.
Okay, thank you. That's bringing us towards the end of our time in this discussion, but I think that that's a really interesting way to leave it about challenging society, making a difference, and that question about what can we do to help people in poverty that was handed in. And yeah, what would be your takeaway for those listening from this discussion, and is there an action that you could take in your local community you can support, whether that's the things we've heard tonight through the Joint Public Issues Team, Poverty Truth Commission, through projects that are run like the church-related community workers. What could you be doing to make a difference and change those structures? And the powers, when we went back about it being about power, and also I think something that stands out from tonight is about relationships as well. So spending time building relationships with people and getting as well. So thank you for everyone for your contributions tonight. Before we end in prayer, I just want to share information about our next episode. So we're going to be taking a mid-season break in 2 weeks' time. It's over half term, so there won't be an episode in 2 weeks. So our next episode is going to be on the 12th of November. It's going to be an interfaith dialogue. We're going to be looking at interfaith and the theme of common ground, which is the URC Youth theme for this year. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation as well on the 12th of November. So you can watch that live and interact at 7 p.m. or it will also then be available to watch back at any time on YouTube or to listen on the podcast. When we've got the break, if you're missing Trialogue, remember that all of the previous episodes are there to watch back, or the last few episodes from this current season on the podcast as well. So perhaps you could go back and listen to some of those, or have your own conversations as well that week to be perhaps to continue the conversations, get a group together, and you could discuss some of these topics as well. It'd be great to hear your thoughts, and remember as well, you can send in your ideas for themes. Tonight's session on poverty was suggested by you, by the viewers. So if there's something that you want to talk about in future episodes, you can let us know, and we will do our best to look at those topics. So thank you again, and thank you for listening, and we will now close in prayer. So, dear Lord, thank you for our conversations tonight. We pray for everyone who is facing the realities of poverty, the difficult situations, those facing uncertainty, and living with those realities. May they know your care and your love, and may you be with them and help and support them in their situations. We give thanks for everyone who is working and fighting against the structures and to change the structures which are causing poverty. And we give thanks for that work and hope that you will be able to help and support and guide those people who are working in that area. We give thanks for the panelists tonight and everybody who is listening, and hope that these conversations will be able to continue, that we will continue to think about what actions we can take and what we can learn from your word this evening and the passage that we've been looking at. Amen. Okay, so thank you everybody, and good night.
Thank you.